lahor, e giga forave. Iku blojko, rusula huki, holaka holala, halagu kuku.
Howdy, welcome back to Film And. It is a warm but dark evening here in Burlington. I'm recording this late because, well, this episode took a bit longer to craft than I thought it would, but it'll be coming in right on time. This is the second part of my Agnes Varda tier list. As you know, a couple weeks ago we talked about the first 5 films of Agnes Varda's career, the cinematic, narrative, full-length feature films. And now we're going to be covering the second half, which I believe is about 7 films. So we have a lot to get through. So I don't want to waste any time. Let's get right on into it. Where we last left off was with 1969's Lion's Love and Lies. But we are coming back. We are jumping from 1969 to 1977, which is in fact the year that Agnes Varda starts s5e5, which is, I guess, her production company, something she started to get some more creative control, I believe, with the distribution and just production of her films. And the first thing to come out of this, I believe, is the film One Sings, the Other Doesn't. This is really for her coming after Lion's Love when it comes to narrative film, not just documentary. This really feels like a return to French cinema. She shoots so much in the streets of Paris, and there are these amazing themes of reflection of womanhood and the artistry within that. And kind of starting this, my prediction going in was a self-reflective look at Varda herself as an artist and kind of the capturer of the female perspective. And this is probably her most upfront display of that to date. I mean, maybe with the establishment of s5e5, she was able to pull more punches and be more overt with her cinematic themes. And similar to Happiness, there are these topics of honest, relatable, everyday life struggle, which is something that's really admirable for this film. Here, it is a young woman experiencing various states of a woman's life in the 1970s France. And I can't help but look at these in such a temporal lens, being very much of their time. And this film really does feel like a direct commentary on the politics and sentiments of 1970s France. I mean, it must be one of her most unabashed looks at womanhood yet. The main plot essentially starts with the protagonist helping to get her friend an abortion, then posing nude for her photographer husband. And there's just some really potent moments throughout all of this, essentially accentuated by Pauline's, the protagonist's, dry wit throughout. There's also this really cool B story away from Pauline, the struggling artist, and the overworked stay-at-home wife. They have this friendship and they want to be together, to be in love with the people they want to love. But there's this struggle of art and family and also sustaining oneself that often leaves people drained. And this is a theme you see just pummeled at you throughout the entire film. It really doesn't let you forget this. There's a scene where the wife, post-abortion, a seemingly small portion of the film, brings her 2 kids to her husband's studio in that classic new wave melodrama until Varda rips the rug out from under you, and when only a few minutes later, the husband hangs himself, overcome with guilt of not being enough. This kind of artist's struggle coming back. And this is really where the movie kicks off into something very different for Varda. And it's every time I get to a movie of hers, I can't help but be impressed by how different the direction she goes in with each film. And this is just such a good example of it. There's this look at Pauline's struggling career in music after this. The title, One Sings, the Other Doesn't, I think it reminds the viewer constantly, I think, that it is a story of these two women finding their place in the world. I mean, that's such an intentional title. Within a short 30 minutes, these two women, one's 17 and the other 22, have lost their entire support systems and are now left with only each other. It's definitely a potent statement of women's rights and social revolution in the 1970s with France, mixed with Varda's new wave sensibilities in a really cool way. And what's crazy is that this film still feels like such a relevant watch as we even fight today for abortion rights, even in our own country here in America. And I think, this really comes through in the visual aesthetic of the film, because I feel like it's informed more and more by Varda's own age and emotional state, particularly her interest at the time of the French inland countryside. Is an interesting use of the timeline. The second portion of the film takes place 10 years after the first, and throughout the second portion there are flashbacks to Pauline's and Suzanne's past while they were apart. The scene where Pauline, which she eventually starts going by the name Apple for her singing career, sings on the canals of Amsterdam with an indiscernible music source. It's Varda's, I guess, slight foray into musical cinema, but it's still so grounded and meaningful. I mean, I just love it. It works so well within the film. Two very different yet equally relatable life paths of these two women, as their stories often find narrative symmetry that's just beautifully portrayed. Just beautiful visuals as always, especially in the countryside, which I find Varda's lens finding more and more coming through here. There's some criticisms, because I can't just sing this movie's praises all day. There's some weird things, there's some weird inserts of narration that often take away from the subtlety of the piece. I imagine that the themes and meaning of the piece are so obvious, why add the narration? But I'm not sure. And also the dialogue feels a bit too close to heavy-handed personal introspection, like Varda could just say it instead of Pauline, and Varda's voice doesn't necessarily match the tone and established voice of her protagonist. So there's this weird kind of melding of who Varda is and who her character is. And I'd like to think, obviously, there's some shared philosophies, but it does feel like that she's not able to translate it into a true character. It still feels a bit too much like her own commentary, and that can kind of take the narrative back a bit. You kind of lose the character, I imagine a lot of movies after this one have taken inspiration from this, or at least they come to similar conclusions of this semi-linear storytelling and the patchwork nature of these slice-of-life scenes. Like a lot of family and relationship dramas of the past 10 and 15 years employ very similar things. And this movie was doing it like 30 years before all of them, and it does feel like it fits in the categories of modern cinema very well. So just for the sake of being pretty revolutionary, but also just an amazing statement from Varda, I give One Sings, the Other Doesn't an X tier for exquisite. X marks the spot. It is a fantastic watch. Next up, 1981's Documenteur is made during her stint living in California, often paired with a documentary about the murals of Los Angeles, which are featured in the film as well. Kind of a dual documentary and narrative film project for her in the early 80s. Right when the film starts, it's called an emotion picture, not a motion picture. And I'm wondering what emotion is going to be. It's kind of hard to tell. I don't know, an emotion picture. It's a bit kind of like artsy-faltsy for me, but I can respect it. We'll see where it goes. This film actually has a much grainier, rougher aesthetic, and it's a much more personal documentary style, but with a narrative insertion, which I kind of like. I think it makes sense. I think Varda is in a very documentarian mindset here, and it comes through in the narrative and just the visual style of showing these characters walk through their lives. I mean, it is a lot of just the camera following them, trying to capture what they're doing. But yeah, a lot of handheld shots, which is honestly a rare occurrence for Varda at this point. It feels like this is even newer territory she's going in. It's a much more cerebral film right off the bat, with the more professional and intentional altsiness of films like One Sings, the Other Doesn't, kind of fallen by the wayside at this point. And the title Documenteur, I think, says it all. I mean, that's very telling of what you can expect here. You know, it also kind of, in many ways, feels like an exploration of words and their relationship to images. You know, it's a real stark contrast of image and word. I mean, the two separate cradling hands of cinema, image and word, breaking different meanings of words down and how words in context change their meaning, especially relating to images that Varda places with them, which makes this a very complex watch, much more so than I thought it would be. It's probably her most experimental narrative film yet. It probably remains that, honestly, moving forward, other than maybe Jane B for Agnes V. But we'll get to that one. That one's coming up. You know, if these documentary feeling shots of real people are stolen or shot covertly, the film editing is some of the best I've seen from Varda, because there's many scenes here where it feels like she's capturing actual moments and she just has the actors walking and existing in those moments. And it's very special and it's very sneaky and you just can't tell. I mean, despite the minimal use of cuts and editing in general in this film, the editing does feel, masterful. I mean, back in America, so Los Angeles, you have some English speaking, which has never been Varda's strong suit. But, you know, there's still a lot of French speaking when it comes to these French characters living in America. This is about a single mother and her son living in Los Angeles. But, you know, there's this central question that threads the various stream of consciousness throughout the narration. And it's like, who are these people, these strangers that we see every day? That's something I see most of all within this film, is just this idea of the viewer's eye is drawn to so many strangers and people, and it is through the lens of the mother, the main character, kind of just people watching and trying to understand what it means to just look at a stranger and think about who are they? What life have they led, you know? The English portions of dialogue, definitely clunky. Not sure if there's an intention, but it's something I've had a suspicion about. I mean, if the dialogue and intention of Varda's films would translate in an English context, which makes some of her English-speaking films, whether fully or partially English-speaking, it kind of makes it weaker to an extent. I think there's definitely something about reading the words on a screen in the subtitles that allows me, personally, to have this sense that's just more poetic. Because the subtitles are still part of the film watching experience, you know? You still get those words on the screen, and me, as someone who can't just listen and understand French, I mean, that's the way I understand the film. And foreign film feels like a hybrid almost of silent film in that sense, where we as the viewers are not speaking the original language or completely reliant on the subtitles for context. Moving on, the neighborhood complex that the mother and son live in are very similar to the claustrophobic ramshackle houses from La Prante Court, Varda's first narrative film, but now revisited in color, which is kind of a cool callback visually. Some criticisms, perhaps, it doesn't feel like the capturing of a time period. It's not a particularly fleshed out character or story. And the cinematography is nice, but not impressive, or really as boundary pushing as we've seen it before in some of Varda's best films. For other artists, I feel like this kind of film would feel like a midlife crisis, but it feels more like a midlife examination for Varda. Through the things Varda is thinking about and tackling with, seemingly reaching her midlife is genuinely intriguing. I guess I just wish it came out in a more salient project, closer to some of her other works, but whatever. It's also something I realized at this point in this giant Varda marathon I'm doing. A lot of the musical scores of her films are very scant and distant, and that I really think that allows her to play with time in an interesting way. I did ask myself, when is it going to end? But not in an impatient way, more of in an inquisitive way, where is she just going to end this story? Because being so open-ended, she could end it anywhere. But this thing has a runtime of 64 minutes, and I'm immediately thrown off as to when the film will end. And the ending, much like Le Creatures from, you might remember, Tier List Part 1, boggles my mind. This is another Varda ending I cannot even fathom or begin to understand. It's very interesting. I kind of get it. I have my interpretation, but it is kind of crazy. So overall, Documenteur, I'd give it a V tier. Very average. But okay, I'm trying to rush through these quickly, but we're going to take a quick PSA break, and I'll be coming back with the next films in Agnes Varda's career.
Running late to class but still need that morning caffeine or hot breakfast to start your day out right? Download the Bite app by Sodexo and place your custom order for fast, easy pickup at Zyme. Open 8:30 a.m. to 3 o'clock p.m. Mondays through Fridays.
All right, and we're back. Agnes Varda Tier List Part 2. I am rushing through these as fast as I can. It's hard to really do some in-depth analysis, so we're going to just go for it. Next up, we're coming into 1985 with her next film, Vagabond. We're finally here. I'm very excited for it. Vagabond stands as an artistic statement that I feel Varda has been building to in her previous works of the past 5 to 8 years. And here she captures the likeness of Mona, a vagabond. We're introduced to Mona in the opening scene as a hardened corpse, dead from exposure in a drainage ditch of a rural French farm property. The film then recounts her final months of life, hitchhiking and surviving alone without a home in the bleak winter of France. Varda, with Vagabond, I think has now turned her lens to a brave and unrelated independent woman, interacting with men who would only help her in exchange for sex, really, which she sometimes obliges, but only ever on her own terms. The unrelenting repetition of this fact, paired with the stigma of the untrustworthy, man-chasing female drifter, makes it a very compelling watch. She wanders her way through various lives of others, and the film often just captures their reactions to her. It feels like Varda is really challenging the idea of a protagonist, creating a vagabond character that almost lives only in other people's stories. And boy, this is not a likable person. Mona is kind of annoying, It's a hard protagonist to root for, which I feel like is the point. You also have Varda now invoking this new imagery of the post-rock and punk scenes of 1980s France, a commentary that was actually quite relevant at the time, as many youths would become drifters and vagabonds and were often seen as parasites and detriments to traditional French society. And it's interesting that Varda, now an established older generation French woman herself, decides to continue to tackle these kind of youthful movements as an artist. I do love that. Mona, as the vagabond, is definitely the type of protagonist that makes you ask what made them this way. Why can't the vagabond settle down? There must have been that time before this phase of her life, where things were different. And the first time that she's given genuine help from a family at a farm, she's put off by their hospitality. And this sequence does wonder to offer a more complex side of Mona, her ambitions, her fears, her hopes, her work ethic, and etc. This scene really does capture that so well. In the words of the farmer towards Mona, your head's empty, you don't exist. And while this vagabond's life is played out on the bleak backgrounds of France in the winter, it makes for a very deep and cerebral film experience, honestly. At so many points, Mona is just a detriment. She is a detriment to the hardworking family who offers hospitality, a detriment to the prostitute she sells cheese to, a detriment to the men she becomes entangled with, and a detriment to people who even offer her rides down the road. Everyone she comes in contact with. I feel like at so many moments, you as the viewer, at least me, is reminded of the fleeting nature of one's surroundings. And the vagabond as a concept fits neatly into that impermanent collection of things in our society that do not last and just slowly fade away from memory. For me personally, I kind of relate it back to how I imagine my hometown when I was a child and how different it is now when I remember these fleeting memories of buildings and streets and trees and people that just aren't there anymore. And I feel like, each interaction with someone who takes the vagabond on reveals something about themselves and something about the vagabond. Often in different situations, the vagabond's presence causes reflection and discussion about others' lives that she passes through. Maybe in this way, this is the narrative impact she leaves on the world, whether she is aware of it or not. This is her lasting mark. The patriarch of the farming family says it best in "It's not wandering, it's just withering." She supports a system she rejects. And that's so fascinating. And I'll leave it to that. Please watch this movie. I'm going to give it a W, worth a watch. It's one of my favorites. So please watch it. Next up, we've got the 1988 film Kung Fu Master, which is, a very interesting perspective on youth culture. Through the outside eyes of the protagonist, who's a single mother who grows into an internally confusing relationship with her daughter's male classmate friend, connecting through his favorite arcade game, Kung Fu Master. And it's really cool to see Varda again embracing and analyzing new social movements like the golden age of arcade and Kung Fu Master, which is a 1988 film. And despite the golden age of arcade games being more like 1979 to 1984, and Kung Fu Master itself, the game premiering in 1984, not only the first side-scrolling beat-em-up video game, but also considered one of the last influential and popular arcade games to come out in that first large wave of arcade games. Varda, at least with this in the visual perspective, is just in a masterful way. It keeps the camera always moving on dolly tracks or pans to almost simulate the look of a video game, very subversively. It's always in motion towards achieving some goal. This constant movement sticks out from the rest of her more contemplative and maybe even fly-on-the-wall aesthetics of some of her other films, which you can see Vagabond, La Bonheur, Les Creatures. Even with some taboo themes of lost youth and budding sensuality, the editing, blocking, and overall narrative seems to be kind of to make this film out to be the most accessible Varda film yet. And that works in her favor, I think. I can't help but be really creeped out by the age difference that the single mother and the young boy are portrayed as. And yeah, perhaps there are some taboos that are treated differently in Europe, but not to this extent. I don't know. It's kind of creepy and weird. Maybe that's the point, but I don't know. There's this interesting hidden thread throughout the film where Varda often discusses and portrays the public perception of the AIDS epidemic through the eyes of children and adults and the media. And, this doesn't really come to a conclusion, but it's interesting that she places this in just at little moments in the film because it makes you wonder how this is connected. This is kind of the first time also that the English dialogue and British sequences come off pretty good. Like, the translation and writing seems to have progressed for Varda at this point. I think she's really mastering scenes in other languages. I don't know. Another fascinating ending from Agnes Varda that really leaves you at kind of considering various angles of the story. And overall, I will give it a V. Very average. Moving on. Jane B for Agnes V, 1988, the same year, which is actually, it's a fascinating hybrid of documentary and narrative, where Varda follows and examines the life and actress, collaborator, Jane Birkin, the protagonist of Kung Fu Master. But she strings together these vignettes that Varda crafts for Birkin as a person. It's very similar visual aesthetics to Kung Fu Master and stands as just a really cool insight into how Varda works with actors and overall the life and perspective of Jane Birkin, French personality as she is. There was a deep familial connection throughout, when she talks about the family she has made for herself and the people around her. And it's really just quite interesting, And at times the docu-vignettes, I guess, become almost self-referential to Varda's own career, like the new wave influence of the Christmas Laurel and Hardy portion. And for the more interview portions she does with Jane Birkin, using this classic Argento color stock that Varda has employed so many times at this point, and I do love it. I think watching this post Kung Fu Master is quite intriguing and fun with the context of a more traditional film that Varda and Birkin made together. So I feel this film deserves a V tier, because it really is only so potent because it serves to be like kind of the more experimental narrative sister film to Kung Fu Master. Two left. We got two left. We're moving on. Next up is 1991's Jacquot de Nantes. I'm saying that probably wrong, but this is another chapter of the inspiration Varda receives, I feel like, from other forms of artistic expression. Paintings, puppetry, opera, etc. And the narrative fits this perfectly. Though to be honest, I don't want to cheat, but the Criterion description, I think, says it best of this film. Agnes Varda's tender evocation of the childhood of her husband, Jacques Demy, a dream project that she realized for him when he became too ill to direct it himself. It is a wonder-filled portrait of the artist as a young man and an enchanting ode to the magic of cinema. Shot in Demy's hometown of Nantes, including the house he grew up in, this imaginative blend of narrative and documentary traces his coming of age as he finds escape from the tumult of World War II in puppet shows, fairy tales, opera, and above all, movies. The formative aesthetic experiences that would fuel his unforgettable expression in his exuberant new wave masterworks. So thank you, Criterion, for that lovely description of this film, making my job that much easier. Some scenes are just these amazing observances of young Jacques' perspective. Various conversations weaving around him in almost Robert Altman-like ensemble constructions. The reality of Jacques Demy's childhood is presented to us in this stark black and white, which we actually have not seen in long form since the 1960s, but all of the culture and the alt that Jacques experiences that sits in his mind, as it does in our own eyes, all these bright technicolor memories of majesty. So the film switches between the kind of black and white reality of his childhood and how, I guess, the alt and the culture he takes in stands apart as this colorful, optimistic memory. And that's such a beautiful creative choice by Varda. There was also narration from Varda about her husband, the real-life Jacques Demy, and the film has these really fascinating, just interweaving moments of reality and reenactment that really lets you fall into the world, as if you're really seeing the life of this mythical individual in the world of cinema. Overall, it is a little tedious, overwhelming, and personal at times, so the meaning might not come through all the way, as it feels like one of the most personal, intimate projects of Agnes Varda. So I will give it a V tier. And we are here at the final film of Agnes Varda. It's a shame I'm at the end. I've really enjoyed this. But we are talking about 101 Nights. A fascinating and surreal final chapter in Varda's narrative career. A joyous celebration of color and the overall history of cinema. Pulling from so much classic imagery. Nosferatu, Orson Welles, King Kong, among many other things we'll talk about. The story follows a young female film buff, honestly, hired to accompany the life of a 100-year-old French cinema legend entitled Mr. Cinema to sit with him, discuss film and its magic. Mr. Cinema is this goofy, eccentric old man who is just often pontificating on his magical career in film, often feeling fabricated by his loose memory of events. He also stands at 100 years old, and with this film coming out in 1995, it's making him essentially as old as cinema itself. He feels like the personification of cinema, a living testament to what's been done. And Varda even, evokes stock footage of these movies mentioned by Mr. Cinema and his rotating mansion guests, from old westerns, classic American monster films, like I said, King Kong, and just Italian and French new wave classics. And even, I love this, obscure and fun Easter eggs of Varda's own career. At a point, Camille, the protagonist, the film student accompanying Mr. Cinema, asks if she can meet him earlier from 5 to 7. 5 to 7, that sounds familiar. And Marcello Mastroianni, who's visiting Mr. Cinema at the time, explains the meaning of 5 to 7 being a traditional period of the day known for being the setting of lovers' trysts, as he says, and which is a hidden theme that Varda herself mentions is kind of lost in translation to international audiences, but it informs her film Cleo from 5 to 7 so much for that. And I can't believe she mentions this in her own film. I do love that. It just released in 1995. It feels like a beautiful encapsulation of movies of the 20th century, an ode to all things cinematic, and in Varda's ever-expanding eye. I think this is a film any film lover can enjoy for its unique style and just capturing of this moment in Varda's career and how she intertwines herself with the history of cinema herself. So I would give it a W tier. Worth a watch. It's very good. And that is all the time we have. Thank you so much for tuning in. This has been a really fun journey going through the films of Agnes Varda, albeit exhausting because there are so many of them and it's hard to find time. I'm very busy. But next week we will have the Halloween episode of Film and, which I will be coming up with at some point. I haven't decided what we will do, but I will think of something hopefully soon. We also obviously have my Film and list on Letterboxd. Every movie we have talked about on this show is there, as well as Cranberry 18's Film and Letterboxd list, which you can find linked below if you're listening to the YouTube page. So yeah, I'll catch you next week. Thank you for listening. Have a good day.